Today we have Bill Phippen, who's kindly going to speak to us about restoring the Great Sydney Station Honour Board. Now, Bill is a member of the Australian Railway Historical Society's New South Wales division, and he has spent a lot of time on this project, and I'm sure that you'll find his talk is very, very interesting. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today.
Well, good afternoon, and it's a great pleasure to be here at Kingswood to present this seminar about something of which I am truly passionate. I really think it is one of the best things I have ever done in my life. I want to tell you something of a very large Great War Honour Board, which was restored to Central Station 2 years ago for the centenary of the armistice. It's not the story of a shabby and neglected relic which had seen better days and needed refurbishment. It is the story of an important memorial to the soldiers of the first AIF, which had completely vanished from both its physical site and public memory. I continue to be amazed that I can find no one who remembers the thing ever being at Central. Don't be misled by these couple of photos from the Mitchell Library. We only found them very late in the project when we already knew where the boards had been. They are the only photos we have found of the complete board in place. It is my contention that the New South Wales Railways and Tramways were the source of the largest group of organised men to serve in the Australian forces in World War I. There may have been more shearers or stockmen or miners, but they were not associated with each other in any way. Certainly there was no other industry which rivalled the railway in employment numbers, and no other state railway supplied nearly as many recruits. 8,477 railway and tramway men enlisted for service. This ridiculously precise number is given in the 1919 annual report. Rather than say railway and tramway men for the rest of this presentation, I will say railway, but include both. One organisation ran both modes of transport, and about a quarter of the volunteers were tramway men. One crucial fact it is important to realise that to create a path to another important source of facts about the lives of these men is that the railway men who enlisted in the AIF had not resigned from the railway service. They had been released from duty to join the expeditionary forces. They were still paid by the railways. They were guaranteed re-employment without detriment to their grade or seniority. Their career in the military was recorded on their railway employment record card. When I say paid by the railways, I mean that their pay was made up to its pre-enlistment level if their army pay was less. This cost the New South Wales Government Railways and Tramways £918,137 before the war was over. This policy did apply to all the New South Wales public servants who enlisted in the AIF. So how can such a large and important thing be lost and then found in Sydney in 2015? Obviously, genealogy is a hobby of great interest. The New South Wales Railways and Tramways 120 years ago were a huge employer, so that everyone has an ancestor who worked for the railways. And what is more, the railways were great bureaucrats. For 40 years, either side of the First World War, they listed every appointment to the service and every removal from it in their annual reports. The New South Wales government was so fearful of an empire-building railways commissioner that they made him do a census of his whole staff every third year from 1890 to 1938 and to publish it in the Government Gazette. What a wonderful source of information for genealogists it is, but it is hard to find names because they are not alphabetical. It is by date and by branch. The volunteers at the Australian Railway Historical Society fixed that. We indexed the whole thing. 714,000 entries. It is one of those projects that had we known its extent when we started it, we wouldn't have, but we did. You can see there on the screen some of those documents. It's a list of appointments, list of removal from the annual reports, the lists in the Government Gazette, and a few other sort of lists we found in funny old documents. We're not quite sure of their provenance, but lists of people. So we rolled them all in. To this list, I added a few other smaller lists, including the Roll of Honour of Great War Dead printed in the 1921 annual report. At only 1,210 names, shocking as that number is in terms of death and loss, it was an easy task after the hundreds of thousands we had dealt with. These are the last few entries in a 9,000-page document. If I dared to print it, you'll notice there on the extreme left-hand lower corner, it's an access, a spreadsheet, and you'll see the line number there is 715,462. It's a pretty large spreadsheet. And you'll see there the last name, the last alphabetical man who's ever worked for the railways, was William S. Zucker. You'll see he was appointed to the electrical branch of the railways in the fourth quarter of 1917. On the 31st of December of that year, he was working in Sydney. His name is included in the Roll of Honour, printed in the 1921 annual report, and he was removed from the railway service in the 1919 annual report in the list for the first quarter. The entry there, if we called it up, would show that he had died on active service. My next target was the honour boards spread about the place. There are some on the eastern suburbs concourse at Central Station, brought in from other places which have been closed and demolished. I wanted to be able to input a name and find all the entries in the annual reports and the Government Gazettes, and also to know that the name appeared on Honour Board 6 on the eastern suburbs concourse, or the one on Hawkesbury River Station. I thought I knew that there were more railway boards in storage at Chullora. So I asked my good friend Jenny Edmonds, Assets Manager of the Railway Heritage Collection, for an opportunity to go to the store and to photograph them. This is where they're stored, in some building which is called the Igloo for obvious reasons. When I got there, she told me that she had the Narrabeen honour boards but had no idea what they were. The best I can glean from subsequent research is that they were delivered to the old heritage store at Everley about 2007, but from where I have no idea. When I first saw them, they were lying on the floor in the old curved roof shed, wrapped in bubble wrap. So we unwrapped them one by one. I soon counted that there were 8, 4 large and 4 small. The larger ones had 4 columns of 62 names, and the smaller ones had 4 columns of 15 names. If you do the arithmetic, as I did on that day, the answer is 1,232. I knew that the printed list of railway dead had 1,210 names, so in a second it became obvious to me what these things had to be: a board showing all the railway and tramway men who had died. This was in 2015, and for the centenary of Anzac, I had done an article in the magazine Australian Railway History trying to make a definitive list of the New South Wales railwaymen who had died at Gallipoli, and the answer I had come up with was 180, and I knew their names. By chance, as we unwrapped, the last we revealed was in fact what I now know to be the first chronologically, the Gallipoli dead. And I saw all the names I knew and was convinced instantly what this 8-component board contained. You look down the first column there, Wilfred Knight, J.H. Cumberland, Thomas McGurk, and so on. I knew all their names. And of course, the fourth name there is G.L. Hargrave, Geoffrey Hargrave. That is Geoffrey Hargrave, son of the kite flying man at Stanwell Park. I knew and was convinced instantly this is 8-component board contained. I took photos as best I could with them flat on the floor and me being only so tall, so that I could compile the names, and we wrapped them up again. As you can see, all of the boards were damaged and 2 were very badly damaged by water. My suspicion is that this damage occurred since 2007 because of storage in this building, the old carriage shed at Everleigh. The boards consisted of a timber case with a glazed door holding a white board on which the names were printed. Apart from the water damage, one name panel, one of the smaller ones, was completely missing, though its case was there. Neither I nor Jenny, nor anyone else, and there is Jenny very proudly at the unveiling, 3 years later, but that's what we're talking about. Those magnificent things on the wall are what we're talking about. We had any idea where these things had been displayed. They did come with the name Narrabeen. Obviously, there has never been a railway at Narrabeen, and there was once a tramway, and the only structure at Narrabeen was a waiting shed, which is actually still there. It's used for buses now. The boards would not fit in it, even if you had a reason for putting them there. It has been suggested that Narrabeen War Veterans Home might have been the reminder of the boards when the railways discarded them, but inquiries there have found no recollection. They are so large that if you had them, you would know you had them. They could not be tucked under the stairs and forgotten. Another suggestion is that Narrabeen is railway slang for a shed. Certainly, the carriage shed in Sydney Yard was known as Bondi, but the siding at McDonaldtown carriage sheds was known as Bronte. But despite asking several old railwaymen, no one can point to a building known as Narrabeen. I thought the name was pointless as we did not know what it meant, so I stopped using it. I did read that the bronze installation in Canberra was in its early days known as the Great Honour Board of Australia. So that's how I coined the name. Then the search was on to find where it had been displayed and when it was put there. There may be people who imagine that all honour boards and war memorials were erected by careful planning and list making by some official memorial authority, probably a couple of years after the war. We of course know that that's not true. I now know that the board I'm talking about grew in at least 4 stages, perhaps over 8 years. I soon found a reference in the budget with that's an in-house, a wonderful monthly magazine in-house for the staff, produced for the railways up till about 1930. So I found a reference to the unveiling of a board on the Grand Concourse at Central in March 1916. The article doesn't say where, and I don't think it was where they are now. There was great ceremonial with choir and pipes and hymns and speeches. Most of the senior railway officers held military rank, so they all came in uniform. Soon we found at New South Wales State Archives this photo of an incomplete panel. It has 162 names, and they are all men who died at Gallipoli. So this, I'm pretty sure, was what was unveiled in March 1916. Another entry in the budget reports that the board at its unveiling contained about 150 names, and that is close enough to 162 for me. The true number is close to 180, but some of the names did not emerge for years. Now, 100 years later, we know that a board with 248 spaces was not enough, and the builders soon realised that too, so more space had to be made. We found plans of the original work. We found the plans of the original work in the ARH's archives, and then plans for enlargements on either side as a kind of hinged shutter. These plans are why I think that the original location of the lone board was different. Where it is now, and it is in the right place, there's no doubt about that, there is a window on either side, not a blank wall to mount an extra panel. The shutters were not built. and the extension came as a second identical board, but it too was filled almost immediately because it's very soon after March 1916 when the first board was put up. In July, we had the Battle of Fromelles. 1,917 Australian soldiers died in a single night, including 52 railwaymen. So the boards were filling quickly. My friend Matthew Moore, the guru of plan finding, located this plan at State Archives, and now we had some answers. The two panels had probably been in their present location for a while when another two panels were added in 1918. The plan certainly shows 3 and 4, the red ones, as an addition to 1 and 2, with the 4 of them where the 8 are now. But even 4 panels were not enough, with space for just less than 1,000 names. The final addition came as 4 smaller cabinets below the 4 originals. They were filled very neatly, so my guess is that they were not made until well after the war, when the list had stopped growing. I would be willing to accept as late as 1924. There are other printed lists of the roll, most notably in successive annual reports. And we know that 30 names were added in 1921. These were generally not men succumbing to wounds, though a few were. Rather, they were the clerks sorting out the whole chaotic mess. This is the record card of William Mendham. William Mendham died in 1917, but his railway record card has a note that the Army did not tell the railways until 1920. Bryant Marsden's card shows routine pay increments until December 1919. He had been killed in 1915, but the railways didn't learn of that until 1920, and there's some writing there written sideways, which you probably can't read, but I've enlarged it. So it just says, well, we weren't told that he died in 1915. We weren't told until 1920. The board was only ever seen as a stopgap arrangement until a stone memorial was erected in the Western Garden of Central Station. Twice a design competition was announced and subscriptions collected, but the work never proceeded. To use the collected funds, a book of the names was produced and kept in the Railway Institute Library. I know that occurred in 1924, for it is reported in budget. Thus, there are at least 3 versions of the roll of names. The 1921 annual report, for none was produced in 1922 or thereafter, the 1924 book, and the honour board itself. The lists are slightly different, but the book and the board are nearly the same. That's why I say that the board may have been finished as late as 1924. The book is a strange production, and it is here at Kingswood. It's been saved, and it's been cherished here. Only one book was produced, and it's a very high quality production with gold embossed cover and all the marks of a prestigious document. However, it is riddled with careless errors. About 30 of the names are badly misspelled. It still exists, and here at Kingswood, of course. We do not know when the board began to be dismantled. As I said, there are 4 of these photos in this set at the State Library, almost all the same. They're the only pictures we have of it complete. And the Mitchell Library thinks they were taken in 1927, but I think that date is just a sort of educated guess on their part. We have no other pictures of the board until 1957, by which stage you can just see there that only the outside 2 are there, that the middle 2 are missing. There's a better photo of the 2 that remain. We can date that photo fairly well because of that the advertising above it about all the newer air-conditioned expresses. And we know when some of those expresses were introduced, and by just seeing which ones are there and which ones aren't, we're pretty confident that the picture was taken about 1957. Again, That's an important photo because although we can't read the names on it, when it came to put them back on the wall, 1, 2, 3, 4, by zooming into that, you can sort of identify which board is which. So we're pretty confident that the left hand and the right hand boards are right, just by the length of the name and the pattern of the shapes. So by 1960, the whole lot were gone and the whole area had been redeveloped and the site occupied by an Avis rent-a-car counter. After Jenny and I had found the board and then identified it, not much happened until 2018. It was under Jenny's responsibility and she was working out what to do and organising funding. Although the board is a New South Wales State Movable Heritage Asset, it was at that time in the custody of Transport Heritage New South Wales. If it were ever to go back to Central, then it would pass into the custody of Sydney Trains. And Amy Kieran from Sydney Trains Heritage Unit looked after making things happen at that end. By early 2018, the decision had been made that the board would be restored and it would go back to Central. But where and when was still open. Perhaps it would have to wait until all the metro works were completed in 2024. The obvious target date was the centenary of the armistice, but I doubted that it could happen so quickly. All credit to Jenny and Amy that it did. One major obstacle was the roof downpipes, which were now on the wall where two pairs of boards had been. They had always been there, but were chased into the wall. Without the boards, they had been replaced on the surface of the wall, so they had to be sunk again. For the boards themselves, the first issue was the state of the cabinets. The glass, the gold leaf and the paint on the back of the glass and the name panels themselves. The cabinets were all there in reasonably good condition, save for a couple of plinths which were missing. They were duplicated. The gold leaf and blue paint had to be redone, and since the proposed place of display was such a public one, the decision was made to use an alternative material to glass. Two of the name panels were hopelessly damaged and one was missing, so the decision was made to replicate them all. The originals have been conserved and stored. How were we to recreate the names we could not read or which were missing? In 2015, I had tabulated the names as best I could read them, so we had a good head start. Some of the names were easily read once the cabinets were open and the detritus, like you can see in the bottom corner of that photo, once the door was open, that could be swept aside, we could read the names. Mercifully, Rhett Lindsay here at Kingswood found a pristine photo of one of the damaged panels. So half of that problem was solved. There was no close-up photo of the other damaged panel. So after cleaning and by using ultraviolet light and all the tricks in their repertoire, the physical restorers, Art and Archival in Canberra, would send me clues by email that the third name was a short one, possibly ending in a round top letter. The branch where the man worked was less severely damaged, so by a process of elimination from a finite list, I worked out all the names. Satisfied that the 4 large panels and 3 of the small panels were accurately known, the missing panel was expected to be easy. But there would be just 60 names left to fill the 60 spaces in the missing panel, but there weren't. There were 64 names left. The only explanation can be that 4 names had never appeared on the board in its original form. But which 4? My answer to that was to look at the growing list over 6 years. In the monthly magazine, The Budget, an ever-increasing list had been published monthly in fits and starts since July 1915. Of the 64 names, 4 had appeared quite early in the magazine and should have been on one of the 4 large panels, but they weren't. Exactly 60 names had not been seen until the 1919 and 1920 annual reports, and it made sense for them to be on the small missing panel, one of the last to be filled. But could I recommend to omit the names of 4 men who were certainly railwaymen and had certainly died on active service? I am not sure that my circumstantial argument is correct. The suggestion I made, and which Jenny adopted, was to place the 4 names in a spare space at the end of the last panel, separated by a space. If better information ever emerges, future custodians will see what we have done and reverse it if required. Otherwise, the restored name panels are a faithful reproduction of what was always there. There are several misspellings, 2 duplications, and 3 men whose names should not be there because they had not died. I also believe that I know the names of 3 other men whose names should be there but have always been missing. We have made no corrections to the boards. If you look carefully on 2 of the panels, the first name and the surname are separated by full stops, the other 6 with commas. That's how it was done in 1916, and that is how it was reproduced. The decision to restore the board was broadened to include the creation of biographies of all 1,219 names upon it. These were intended to be published on a website, and they are. I'll leave that slide on the screen for a little while, just so if you want to copy down that website. The writing task was entrusted to the Australian Railway Historical Society, and I was very privileged to lead a team of 3 other writers, that's Dougal Black, Richard Matthews and Lily Summer, supported by other researchers who wrote the stories. Realistically, in April 2018, 1,200 biographies could not be expected before a November unveiling. So Jenny's request was for 200 to be done by that date, with the remaining 1,000 to be completed a year later. In fact, we got so enthusiastic and so organised, we had them all done before November 2018. In fact, we had enough time to have a few copies printed as a book to hand to those who had worked on the project and to the VIPs at the unveiling ceremony. The basic sources are, as for any Great War soldier, the Australian War Memorial website and the National Archives of Australia files of their military records. Clearly, for a single man, trove searches and birth deaths and marriages records could be accessed in detail, but with 1,200 to do, there had to be a limit. Something else I should tell you of these 8,500 men is that they were almost all general duty soldiers. Railways were absolutely vital to supply the front in every sense, but only one small section of a few hundred men was specifically recruited to use their railway training. This was the 6th Broad Gauge Railway Operating Company, recruited in 1917, virtually totally in New South Wales, of New South Wales Government railway men. 4 other companies were recruited in other states, and a 5th was formed by gathering men of railway competence from units already in Europe. Broad gauge, in the name of the unit, means in our terms standard gauge, and the comparison is with the French metre gauge and even smaller gauges which operated much closer to the front. The 6th Broad Gauge Railway Operating Company was a cohesive New South Wales unit which had specific loyalty to its Railway Commissioner, James Fraser. At Christmas 1917, they actually produced Christmas cards for themselves to send to their families, but they also produced this gigantic Christmas card which was sent to James Fraser. Basically, that the spiel on the right there expresses their great pride in the New South Wales railways and tramways, and how they hope they can their work in Europe can bring honour to New South Wales. And then this card is signed by every member of the company. The artwork was done sort of perhaps not in the frontline trenches, but probably at Amiens or somewhere very close behind the front, by someone in the 6th Broad Gauge. Every man, his number and his signature. And if you remember back to the beginning of this presentation, that very attractive artwork, that's pinched from the Christmas card. Although they were full members of the first of the AIF, they were not expected to fight at the front, so fitness and age limits were relaxed. No member of the 6th Broad Gauge died as a result of enemy action. There were a few deaths due to accidents and disease, so their names are on the board. To learn of the railway careers of these men, we looked to the Railway Archives at Kingswood. Their employment records still exist, as I'm sure as the volunteers listening to this know all too well. They all still exist in the State Archives, and they're accessible. Much more accessible now rather than they were 2 years ago. The normal procedure at that time was to request a name and wait for the card to be found after a 20-minute search time. Plainly, 1,200 request forms and standing in a queue 1,200 times was out of the question. State Archives supported the project heavily and allowed us to have the cards 8 boxes at a time. There's a typical card, and that's a photo of that young man from the War Memorial website. Still, there were 194 boxes, and every box but one held a card we wanted. We found about 90% of the cards. This is more than reasonable, for cards are only meant to exist for permanent employees, and many of the soldiers were far from that and only had the most trivial railway careers, like George Jones. He has no railway career. The only entries on his card are he was granted leave and he was killed. I suspect that sometimes cards were created when they normally would not have been because the men were dead, and it suited the railways to bring within their fold another of the noble warriors. A kinder view of the railways was that they wanted to ensure that no man was robbed of any honour they could bestow on him. We did have a fallback resource for those for whom we could not find a card. The digitised list of names from the annual reports and the government gazettes, which had started this whole saga, we still had that, and so we could look up that to find a name. And so we knew that John Barnwell, we had a picture of his grave, so we knew he was dead, and his name is on the honour board, so we presume he's a railwayman, but in what sense we didn't know. Well, by looking at our massive list, we found that there were 3 entries in the government gazette in 1905, 1911 and 1914 for him as a casual employee. So we were satisfied he was a railwayman. Of the 1,219, there were only a handful that we could not find at the War Memorial, the National Archives, or at Kingswood, in the annual reports or the government gazette. Although I have already said that we know the number who served exactly, we do not know their names, all of their names at least. One of the 3 yearly censuses occurred during the war years in December 1917, and this lists 5,335 men, railwaymen and tramwaymen, as serving with the AIF. A definitive list might be established by a search of the 194 boxes of the record cards, but will I ever live long? I don't think I'll live long enough to do that. I doubt that I need to recount the military experience of all these men. It is the same as all the other members of the AIF, but I will draw out a few anomalies on the board. The names Thomas Flynn and John Murray appear twice. Flynn, a tram conductor, died at Gallipoli, perhaps on Anzac Day itself, and Murray was a track worker who died in France on the 15th of April, 1917. The name R.W. Pearce, spelt with a C, is at the end of the last panel, and it is reasonable, as I now know that he did not die until 1921. The problem is that there is no soldier of that name listed at the AWF, Australian War Memorial, or the National Archives. The list in the book at the Railway Institute, however, gives his first name as Ralph, and a search at the War Memorial for Ralph gives a very long list, but you can work your way through it. Ralph, and it leads to the name of Ralph W. Pearce, spelt with an S. The honour board is spelt wrongly. He returned to Australia, resumed work with the railways, but developed tuberculosis and died in Sydney on 13th of April, 1921. We know that that date is correct, as his New South Wales death certificate is in his National Archives file. You probably know that the cut-off date, you see in the bottom corner, that's a little extract from the War Memorial website. The cut-off date for inclusion in the honour roll on the wall in Canberra is the 31st of March 1921. They had to draw a line somewhere because men kept dying or had their lives shortened forever. So why is Ralph Pearce's name on the board. It is on the board in Canberra when he's past the cut-off date. Because if you look in their records at the War Memorial, they think he died on the 13th of March. But one can only guess that the next of kin conned the War Memorial. John Squire Armstrong's name should not in all probability be on the board at all, although he certainly died on active service. No connection can be found between him and employment with the New South Wales Government Railways and Tramways. However, a man named John Hutchinson Armstrong was an employee, and he did serve in the war and he did survive. An entry on John Hutchinson Armstrong's card, that's his card sort of to the top left there. I've sort of blown up a few bits of it. I hope you can read them better. An entry, so it's on the 20th of September 1917, shows that he was killed in action. Although, as you can see, that entry is ruled through, and there's a note beside it, above it there, which says mistaken for another man, presumably mistaken for John Squire Armstrong. Research and archives are a quiet and sober business, but when I saw an entry like that on a document, I was particularly delighted. I was sitting in the reading room at Kingswood, and I went close to being called to order by the counter staff for getting a bit loud and raucous and screaming loud. After the war, Armstrong worked at Everleigh in the sawmill until his death in 1931. There is every likelihood that he walked through the assembly platform and passed the Roll of Honour, but whether he ever saw his record card with its revoked record of his death, or knew that J.S. Armstrong's name displayed on the wall of the station was in some senses meant to be his name, is unknown. He was just 36 when he died, so perhaps he was a casualty of the war after all. Albert James Pryer had a career with the locomotive branch from 1910 until 1936, including nearly 3 years active service in Europe. There is no obvious entry in his military record which could lead to a misunderstanding that he had died. After the war, he resumed his railway career. Working at Everleigh, the inclusion of his name on the Roll of Honour must have been known to him. The later, more considered annual report and the annual report list and the Institute book do not include his name. They knew his name shouldn't be on the board, but there was no facility to remove names or cut them out or write over them, so it stayed. He died in 1936, aged 47. Hector Roy Olsen does have an employee record card with the New South Wales Government Railways. It does record military service, and it does indeed record his death in action. However, that entry is ruled through without explanation. He is also recorded in the annual reports as having died on active service. No person of the name Hector or Roy Olsen is listed in the National Archives records or at the Australian War Memorial. He may have enlisted under another first name, but perusal of the 176 Olsens who did serve does not readily identify which one he might be. He seems never to have returned to Australia and was written off the books in 1921. The error of having his name on the board was realised but could not be undone. His name was omitted from later compiled lists. There are 3 names for which it is difficult to justify their exclusion from any honour roll. Cyril Roy Chisholm was a shop boy at Goulburn from 29th of April 1914 until he resigned on the 3rd of March 1915. He enlisted at Liverpool the next Monday, the 8th of March. Many other men whose names are included had resigned, perhaps in ignorance that they didn't need to resign, they just needed to get leave, before immediately enlisting. He died in the charge on Hill 60 at Gallipoli. Alfred Bremberg Christie is a very colourful character. He was an electrical junior at Rozelle. He was underage when he wanted to enlist in 1914, so he walked away from his employment in Sydney to enlist in Melbourne under a false name, Alfred Delaney, with a little bit of nonsense as to he was born in India and his father lived in a hotel, and it was most sort of strangest sort of details of his history. He served under the name Alfred Delaney and died under that name, although the War Memorial and his headstone do record both names. It would seem reasonable that he would have very little claim to inclusion on any of the New South Wales Government Railways and Tramways Rolls of Honour. However, an honour board was unveiled for the line and bond testing staff at Rozelle on 25 July 1917, and it does include Alfred Bremberg Christie. This is an item from the railway and tramway budget, and there's a photo of the honour board. I don't know that that little thing has survived. And there, I've underlined it in red that it says A.B. Christie killed in action, A.B. Christie killed in action. So it's pretty certain, and the railways recognise it, so really his name should be on the board. The 1 January 1918 issue of Railway and Tramway magazine included a paragraph-long obituaries for 8 railwaymen who had died on active service, including Private P.R. Mears, who it is stated had been employed in the Hamilton loco sheds. Percy Roland Mears did serve and did die in France in November 1917. He lists his calling on his attestation papers as cleaner, a job description well recognised in railway parlance as a rung on the career path to fireman and driver. But his name is included in no roll of honour. He has no employment record card. He may be the Percy Mears who was working as a pickman on the West Maitland degree to duplication in 1914, according to the Government Gazette lists. It might be assumed that the New South Wales the honour board would be a simple subset of the large bronze installations on the walls of the War Memorial in Canberra. This is not so. For the Sydney cabinets contain the names of the New South Wales Government Railways and Tramway employees who died as a result of service in the Great War, whereas the Canberra panels list the names of persons who died as a result of service in Australian military units. A number of the railwaymen who enlisted were British-born, recent arrivals in New South Wales, and they chose to return to the United Kingdom. They left with the first contingents of the AIF. They went to return to the United Kingdom, and they enlisted with units, with British units, with which they had some traditional link. This had no consequences for their inclusion in the New South Wales Government Railway rolls. It does, however, mean that their names are not displayed on the walls in Canberra. So this book will be produced in haste, went to the printers 3 weeks before the unveiling date. We named it From Eddie Avenue to Menin Gate. Honestly, that was a title made up around a table in a few minutes, 3 weeks before the unveiling date, and the book had to go to the printer that day. Eddie Avenue is the interface between the railway and the tramway, and the City Railway Bridge over Eddie Avenue does have a plaque noting the march along that street by the men on their way to the wharfs. It should be realised that the bridge wasn't built until 1926, so the plaque might be on the bridge, but the men didn't walk under it. We did have a picture of the tramway arch with the honour board beside it, and that reminded us of the arch of the Menin Gate. As for all Australian soldiers who died in the Great War, about 1/3 of the men named on the Great Sydney Station Honour Board have no known grave. So the Menin Gate Memorial, the Villas Bretton Memorial, or the Lone Pine Memorial is their memorial. Yes, most, but not all of the names are on the walls in Canberra, but only in Sydney, at our most important station, are the names of all the New South Wales railways and tramway men who died as a result of active service displayed and honoured together. 3 names are missing, and we will not tamper with the historical artefacts by altering the board, but the names are included in the book and on the website. So there's just a few pictures of the thing as it exists today. They've put little rails in front to stop people sort of lounging too close to them, but people just sit behind them now and lean on them while they wait for their train. Magnificent things. It always gives me a thrill when I walk through Central, and if someone is unfortunate enough to be standing there looking at them in a puzzled way, I always accost them and say, do you want to know more about it? And then they cop sort of hours and hours of talk about the board. And here they were on their with the wreaths in front of them on the day they were unveiled. And there's a very proud Bill Phippen on the left there, standing in front of the board, and the chief, who was the chief executive of Sydney Trains at the time, Howard Collins, doing the dedication of the boards. Now, as a sort of little subsequent effort, the boards were unveiled on the 8th of November, and time to travel to Canberra for the actual anniversary, the centenary. And with the Railway Historical Society decided that we would lay a wreath at the War Memorial at the closing ceremony to remember the New South Wales railway and tramwaymen who had died in the First World War. And so in the top left of the picture, you will see that's the part of the honour board. There's some artwork there. So we pilfered that and put it on a card, which was attached to the wreath. On the lower photo there, you'll see myself and one of my colleagues laying the wreath at the War Memorial. And there is a photo on the right of the wreath. Now, the wreath obviously will decay, but the card will be kept and archived by the War Memorial forever. So the same graphic is there on that card. And so thank you for listening. I am very passionate about this. I hope that's come through to you. Here's more of that wonderful artwork from the 6 broad gauge, produced in a tent or a hut just behind the Western Front in 1917.